Okay, so I'm Adrian Thorgood. I'm the manager of the Regulatory and Ethics Working Group of the Global Alliance, which is focused on international sharing of human genomic data. And so I coordinate a network of 200 regulatory and ethics experts around the world, sort of tackling challenges of ethics and consents in research. So I was sent a title of my slide, Ethics and Consent. So if you send any text to a lawyer, the first thing you're going to get back is a document with track changes. So I did modify my slide. I want to focus on a more general term of governance, which sort of encapsulates consent. But we can't really talk about consent and consent language without also talking about how we're going to govern data downstream. And I'd also like to highlight my colleague Emily is here with me as well, and Bartha Knoppers is leading the ethics working group, which we're getting off the ground for the Human Cell Atlas. So just a quick outline, I'm going to just talk about ethics frameworks in generally when we talk about biomedical big data and open science. So how should we approach the topic of ethics? I'm going to cover three quick topics, and then we're going to talk about some potential practical next steps for the HCA. Okay, so when we talk about ethics in biomedical big data, most historic or most existing research frameworks are sort of premised on protecting participants from harm. So these are really kind of based in the experimental research space. And they take a rights-based approach. So they focus on, many emphasize that the rights of the participants take primacy over the goals of research. So when we're doing data-intensive research or data sharing, this rights-based and protectionist approach can sometimes be frustrating and also seem to be inapplicable. And so you'll see many data sharing policies will take a sort of a balancing approach. They'll emphasize there's all these great societal benefits. We can accelerate research, we can improve healthcare, we can stimulate the economy. So there's all these great societal benefits, so we have to they emphasize striking a balance between that and the privacy interests of participants. Now those kind of policy arguments, I'm sure everyone would nod in the room to those here, but if you're talking to regulatory professionals, so lawmakers, regulators, or ethics boards members, they may not be as receptive to those kind of policy arguments. There are, of course, ethical arguments you can make for data sharing, that it reduces duplicative research and the relating harms to participants. But I wanted to share with you the overarching framework that we developed within the Global Alliance. So a framework for sharing genomic and health-related data. And we based this framework on human rights principles. And in particular, we aim to activate the human right of everyone to benefit from the progress of science. And I'll just highlight two quick benefits of taking this human rights approach. First of all, it gets you to focus on the ultimate, who's going to ultimately benefit from accelerating research through data sharing. And that's the future patients. So it gets you to focus not on a tension between researchers fighting to get data from participants, but it makes you think, okay, well, we have to consider, in the end, what we're talking about is future patients versus participants. And I think, that's a much more attractive to be balancing between those two groups. Secondly, because we use a rights-based approach, so this human right is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's been signed and ratified by about 165 countries around the world. So it allows us, because we're using rights language, it allows us to get to that question of balancing. Because even within the law, if you have rights that are conflicting, so the right to privacy, in Europe there's even a right to data protection. And so instead of using that as a trump card, saying no research because it infringes on the rights, we're saying, well, we're going to balance these rights. And so we can talk about proportionality, which is a legal term for balancing, what courts use to balance when rights are in conflict. And one just last quick point, if we are doing that kind of adjudication and balancing of interests, researchers and even lawyers don't always have the right answers about what an appropriate balance is. So increasingly we see, especially in large-scale genomic research projects, is a need to incorporate the views of the public and the participants into governance. Okay, so this is actually an international survey run out of the Wellcome Genome Campus here by Anna Middleton. It's called Your DNA, Your Say. It's available in multiple languages. So this is just one approach of integrating people's perspectives into governance. So this is a survey about what do people think about their data being shared around the world. And there's many other ways you can consult patient groups on when you design consent forms. You can include them on your access committees, for example. But this participatory approach is important as we move towards these sort of balancing approaches to governance. So the first, one of the first questions you always kind of get to when you're excited, you're doing all your research, and then someone asks you, well, is your data identifiable? And this is an important threshold question because it leads to sort of default obligations to seek consent and to keep data confidential. So we actually worked on an RNA API ethics primer a couple of years ago, some of your colleagues, that I think will be easily, we can kind of easily adapt for the HCA. But so we talked a bit about what is gene expression data and just on the level of counts and quantifications from a common sense view that doesn't necessarily seem very identifiable. And so it's just a question of being careful about the selection of your annotation genome. So where possible, if you could use a general reference genome as opposed to individual genome, then you wouldn't necessarily be sharing human genomic data. And you have to also be careful, you're going to be developing metadata standards over time for the community. And so another thing to keep in mind is if we're trying to identify where that sample came from, the metadata may, in some cases, contain private information. Now, you're all risk seekers because you're rushing off and collecting samples and doing research before you've even defined the data types that you're going to be dealing with. So this is a non-identifiable, I've made sure it was a photo from the back, a picture of a royal family member skydiving. So I was reading about your skydiving approach in the white paper of over time you will be sort of you didn't necessarily think of it from the risky approach, but not necessarily being totally clear on what kind of data you're going to be generating and what kind of data you're going to be sharing. However, I don't think this is too big a problem because at the end of the day, at most, you'll be sharing human genetic data, whether it's from, it can be inferred from mRNA sequences or whether you're doing you end up doing single cell genomic sequencing. And potentially also health data. So we've already achieved this. There's many international collaborations that are sharing rich genomic and health-related data. So I think we'll be okay. But one thing that's important to keep in mind, and this is when I get to this idea of governance, is that when you share data globally, people kind of get afraid. They don't know where data is, and ethics boards, they don't know where data is going to go. They don't know who's going to access it. And so you get into these hypothetical debates about privacy risk. Well, what if one day, 20 years from now, a hacker with incredible statistical techniques and a huge pile of publicly available data for linkage can re-identify the participant? And then that hypothetical risk ends up blocking data sharing early on. And so the only way to get out of those hypothetical debates is, first of all, fire all the computer scientists who are doing those kind of statistical techniques today. No, we actually really need it because it's great to know about the risk. Second of all, is you need to give people a sense of the governance. What's going to happen to the data once you release it from your biobank or your lab? What's going to happen to it? Is it going to, what organizations are going to keep it? Who's going to have access to it? What are they going to have use it for? And governance, just like the risks evolved, governance itself can also evolve over time. So it's important to get people to focus on concrete privacy risks. Otherwise, we're going to lose out on the concrete benefits of sharing. So moving on to broad consent. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with this. We mentioned the term open consent here a few times. I looked up the Human Developmental Biology resource just to make sure. But typically when you say open consent, an international standard is really broad consent. And I think we're kind of using those synonymously here. So broad consent includes two components. One is the consent language, so consent to future unspecified research. And the second component is this word I keep coming back to, governance. So ongoing oversight of data. There's many different governance mechanisms we'll get to. So first of all, it's important to keep in mind that there's those two elements. And secondly, at this point, there has been a lot of debate about broad consent, but it has, in the specific context of data-intensive science and population biobanking, broad consent has largely been accepted, not just in practice, but it's actually been adopted in the last few years into most international and national guidelines. So World Medical Association, World Health Organization, 2016 guidelines, the new final rule in the US, and even our infamous European General Data Protection Regulation. So in the recitals at the beginning of the regulation, it mentions that we can't always get informed consent. And remember, this regulation applies to personal information. So that's when, if you're collecting rich enough genetic data and health-related data and that you're drifting into personal information, then we're considering these. But it says, it recognizes the challenge researchers face and that we can't always get a specific consent in the research context. Now, it's important to remember that it's great news. It's great news that not only do people practice broad consent, but that it's accepted. It's actually detailed in regulations now. However, I was reading a quote from the UN that they're doing a study on the right to privacy. It was published, first draft in November, and it said, the biggest challenge for information societies is striking the right balance between societal benefits and individual rights. Now, that quote comes from the context of law enforcement surveillance. And we can see that in that context, there has been quite a big regulatory and societal backlash with, a sense of US overreach has led to the Schrems decision, which now, kind of undermines the ability of companies to transfer data from Europe to the US. And so this is going to continue to be a contested area. And we can already see that even though the regulation adopted, a relatively balanced approach, there's already interpretive guidance, draft guidance that's come out from European regulators that has said, well, wait a minute, if you're dealing with special categories of data, then we're going to use a very narrow interpretation of that broad consent opening. And and research groups have responded to this, and they have their own PR groups now that are lobbying groups that kind of keep reminding the lawmakers not to screw everything up for biomedical research. They also insist on enabling more individual participation and decision-making when it comes to their data. Now, when people release their data through a broad consent, they still have an autonomous choice because they can say yes or no. Yes, you can use my data, or no, and they can walk away. So they still have autonomous choice. But there's been a lot of push to why can't we adopt new mobile technologies to increase our connection engagement with participants and allow them to make decisions over time. So that's typically called dynamic consent. And these regulators have also said, well, people should still, be able to withdraw their data at any time. That's increasingly being phrased as a right. And we can think about, these things seem infeasible to us when we're doing open science, when we're releasing data. But we can start to think about ways we can design our networks, such as if we do federated networks and the data and accountability for data stays locally, then it may be possible for people to withdraw data over time. Just a quick note on governance. So governance includes many different things, privacy and security standards. So the strategy we take in the Global Alliance is to try and harmonize those standards around the world, around research centers around the world, so that people trust that if we move from a proprietary model to an open science model, that as data moves between all of you researchers, it'll stay protected. And so access is another area where it's important to harmonize governance. So when we say open access, who can access the data? What can they use it for? What kind of accountability mechanisms, such as data access agreements, are important? And in this case, just to point out that the IHEC, when they moved from establishing their reference map to sharing raw data, they've had issues because they haven't been able to agree on a standardized approach for data access agreements. Some of the sites have insisted on having a really detailed, strict sort of legal agreement for releasing data. So this is something to think of in the long term. If we want to start sharing raw data, what steps do we need to take to be able to do that? And governance isn't just rules and policies. Through the Global Alliance, we've also been developing, integrating technology into how we govern data. And the goal is to both to strike a proportionate balance between openness and privacy, but also to build confidence. We can use these tools to build confidence that data will continue to be governed respectfully. So I mentioned federated data models, which have good privacy upsides. It means the data doesn't necessarily need to leave the institution where it's collected, and we can run federated analyses. This is a sample of our data use ontology, where we've created a standard model for representing access and use restrictions as metadata, and it can travel with the data over time, which increases the chance that it'll be used responsibly. And we also have a library card, which is aiming to automate the assessment. Once you assess a researcher's credentials, they should be able to take that library card. We don't need to do that duplicatively. They should be able to take that to many different data sites. Just a quick note on emerging challenges. So I'm glad I came after Mena's talk on the organ donation. I've talked mainly about data sharing, and that's, I think, the focus on this consortium level. But many of the projects are going to, when we move from sequencing one DNA molecule from an individual to kind of taking entire organs and transferring that into data, that's going to raise, I think, some important questions about biosample collection, storage, and to some extent similar governance questions, because you're going to want to share, to some extent also, you're going to want to share samples. And that's a bit harder, and the laws that apply to samples and sample transfer are more complicated. We've actually done a 20-country study of the laws that apply to biobanks. And so in the Global Alliance, we've kind of said, well, samples can stay, and even sensitive data can stay locally, and let's just share the data. But thinking about these questions, I think one of the big challenges for the HCA will be thinking about material transfer as well. And also, we've seen that you're collecting your samples in quite sensitive situations. So whether it's women who've had abortions, who are being asked to, this is a novel context to ask someone to consent to genetic research, or asking a family member asking someone to sign a waiver before they die to make their their organs available for research, or asking a family member if they're willing to sign the broad consent. These are challenging contexts. They raise a lot of legal uncertainty. So is it even possible to do research in these contexts in some countries? And maybe the models we've achieved in the US and in UK may not be easily transportable elsewhere. Who has the legal authority? Can a family member consent on behalf of a dead family member? Or is it necessary for that person to also consent in advance with a written donation, or are both needed? These questions are sort of unanswered. I think these are areas for further inspection relating to the HCA. So just a few kind of ideas, and I think we can talk about this in the breakout session tomorrow, but what are the practical needs? This is really one of my first interactions with the HCA beyond really reading contributing a bit to the white paper, but how can we help you? So that's part of the idea of why we're here this weekend. As I mentioned, we've developed a bit of an ethics primer, which helps to demystify and explain why it's important to collect all these new data types, and also to share them, and what governance would be in place. So that's something that we can develop maybe once, and that can serve as a template for various different sites. And obviously on the consent approach, just to borrow some of the strategies we use with the International Cancer Genome Consortium, we're right now developing an assessment tool which will allow you to consider if you're sharing genomic or identifiable data, it'll allow you to assess whether you have the appropriate consents. And this applies retrospectively. So if you've already collected your data, we can go back, get your consent form, and see, does this cover international data sharing? And if not, we have strategies. You don't just have to throw it out. We have strategies about how you can go back to your ethics board and potentially negotiate a waiver if consent is not possible and if the risks of sharing are low. Just to point out that the Global Alliance has a regulatory and ethics toolkit. We've already addressed many of these questions of consent and privacy and security. Happy to discuss any of those tomorrow. So thanks, everyone, and I really hope to see a lot of you at the breakout tomorrow. And also my email's there. Please, if you can't attend the breakout and you have a burning ethical or legal or compliance issue, please email it to me so we have a good sense of what issues you're dealing with.
Questions for Adrian? Yeah. That was a very interesting presentation. And I just wanted to comment that I think sometimes basic scientists like me don't understand the nature of the relationship between a patient and a doctor. And in our hospital, we certainly have patient representatives at many of our discussions. And what really surprised me at one of our meetings was that we have a formal method for consenting patients, sharing data, but we never think that for some faiths or beliefs, moving pieces of tissue within one hospital trust is like splitting your soul. And I don't think I would ever have known that if I hadn't had the benefit of being in a meeting with patients who are great advocates for research. But I think these people don't care at all about somebody in Canada reading their DNA sequence, but they do care a lot about tissue specimens leaving the hospital where their loved one died. So I'm a big advocate, actually, of listening to, trusting clinicians and listening to the patients to get it right, at an individual level.
Well, thanks for sharing. That's interesting, novel information for me as well. But thanks for sharing that. I certainly think that we've glossed over a little bit over those difficult, explaining those difficult parts of research. There has been some really helpful research within the GTEx project around organ donation and what's the best approach to talk about the potentially disturbing approaches, the potentially disturbing components of a research protocol. And so there is guidance emerging on that topic. Oh, go.
Okay. Really nice talk, Adrian. Just so one I guess question that popped into my mind is, what about siblings or children or other descendants of somebody who's a donor? I mean, they might be identifiable through this information. I don't know how we think about that, or whether anyone thinks about that.
Sure. So there's a whole, in the annals of genetic ethics and data governance, the family members question comes up all the time. Should we return results to family members? If we find a clinically relevant result, do researchers have an obligation to inform family members? When we talk about privacy, even of the dead, we often say, well, this could implicate the privacy of family members. The law, unfortunately, is not because most rights are individual. There's not widely recognized familial rights in data. But it's certainly something that's thought about in the design of these ethics approaches, balancing individual choice versus familial risks.
Right. So again, it comes into this idea of governance, I guess.
Yeah, we can kind of get around it. But I mean, one example in the GTEx is that they let family members consent to the genetic research. Mm-hmm. And that's probably more out of a moral obligation, because legally, the signed consent is what matters before the person dies. And they can't really, family members aren't really supposed to overturn that, at least in Canadian jurisdiction.
So, recent conversations on this topic, I had a simplifying thought, which is I used to be a professor in an anatomy department, and now I live in San Francisco. My body is signed over to UCSF Medical School, so that when I go, the students can do what they want with me and, I don't know, throw it away. All medical schools teach students, and they must do this. So they must have banks of pre-consented people who've given their whole self over to the university. So that consent must somehow exist in many countries already as a format.
But not for So in the NIH people should comment, but I think it's pre-2015. Oh yeah, I'm not the expert. So the NIH folks should comment, but I believe that if it's pre-2015, it has to be assessed, and if it's post-2015, it has to be explicit that this is consented for sequencing, for genetic data collection. So the fact that you've donated your body does not mean that it's for every research purpose. That I think the open-ended consents become non-open-ended after a certain date. I'm not an expert, though.
And I do know there are people here who are.
I think we can continue the discussions tomorrow in the
Sure.
breakout. Thank you so much, Adrian.
And thank you for
coming in.
putting your money where your mouth is and donating to science.